in the book, you talk about a few different things. You've got the concept of the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler. And I was talking with Marcus a bit earlier about using bureaucracy's weight against itself in the sumo wrestler. I think Occam's razor and the idea that perfection is achieved not when there's nothing left to be added, but when there's nothing left to be removed, is something near and dear to my heart. It's like I'm Captain No when it comes to new features. And the idea of introducing chaos. Can you tell us a bit about the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler? And you can read the book, or anyone can read the book and learn about them. But how did you come up with these as concepts?
Yeah. Well, just to back up a little on what you started out with there, people do resist bureaucracy. But one of the points that I was trying to make is a lot of bureaucracy passes unnoticed. There's a lot of it around us all the time, and we don't object to it because it's not getting in our way. And so I try to distinguish between bureaucracy that gets in your way and bureaucracy that doesn't, or I say good bureaucracy versus evil bureaucracy. Either way, the evil bureaucracy has certain characteristics that are not necessary for bureaucracy. There are certain characteristics that tend to get added to bureaucracy that cause us all the pain that we experience. And if you can take those characteristics and get rid of them or turn them into the positive equivalents or not analogs, the corresponding positives, then you can actually make the bureaucracy work for you in many cases rather than against you. The key to doing so, I think, is the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler, obviously. I started not with those three ideas exactly, or maybe they were, subconsciously in my head or something. I started by going back over the techniques that I had used to deal with bureaucracy in the government environment where it's very strong. And I put together this playbook of, something like 30 or so techniques that we used to change bad bureaucracy into good bureaucracy so that we could be flexible and get the agility we wanted. And then I looked at those 30 or so plays and I said, this is interesting. They sort of divide themselves into three groups. There are really three almost personalities behind them or ways of thinking. And I gave a name to each of those groups that I think sums it up. And those names were the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler. I realized that, let's take the monkey first. The monkeys traditionally are playful, mischievous, provocative. Almost, so many cultures have this trickster character in their mythology or their legends, and it's very often a monkey. So the monkey techniques for dealing with bureaucracy have to do with being mischievous in a way, being a little provocative. For example, taking some liberties in how they obey the rules. So I called it provoke and observe. I borrowed that phrase from somewhere. Provoke and observe the same way as we say inspect and adapt in the agile world. The monkey does that, provokes and looks to see what happens. So a bunch of the techniques that I associated with the monkey are that kind of provocation and observation, let's say. The razor sums up another group of those techniques because they all have to do with trying to make things that are wasteful leaner. So turning bloat into leanness, let's say. So trimming away the fat is a way to think about what the razor does. And that includes standard lean approaches, based on lean manufacturing and Toyota production system, but also some other ways that I discovered that you can be leaner in a bureaucratic environment. And then the sumo wrestler is the fun one for me as well. The sumo wrestler is about turning bureaucracy back on itself. And I was surprised to discover that you can do that, actually, that bureaucracy can often be your ally in defeating bureaucracy. And the example from my experience is that we were faced with this big bureaucratic process called MD 102, Management Directive 102. And we had to follow this, huge, well-defined, rigid process for everything we did in IT. And it involved writing 87 documents and going through 11 gate reviews to get permission to move on to the next step, and define 22 different oversight roles. It was just this huge machine of a thing. And one of the things we did to get to be able to work within it was we created our own bureaucratic policy. And our bureaucratic policy only involved 2 gate reviews instead of 11, and only 15 documents instead of 87. And we knew we could do even better than that, but that was a start. And it was very formal. It was written in bureaucratic language. It was beautiful. It's like a work of art when you master the tools. And we realized that often auditors, what they're doing is they're comparing your policy with what you're actually doing in practice and making sure they're the same. So we realized that the auditors would actually be enforcing our new policy if we did this right, if we pulled the right levers. And so, in fact, the auditors were enforcing that everybody followed really good IT practices, what I would consider good practices. So that's an example of the sumo wrestler. This is turning the strength of bureaucracy around.
But what was the back door?
The back door, it was partly that nobody questioned it because they love to see a formal policy written down. But it was also a mapping, essentially. A thing we did once that proved that we were satisfying all of the requirements of the big thing with our smaller thing. And that mapping we didn't have to do every time. We only had to do it once. And it was a little struggle to get people to agree that, in fact, it did accomplish the right things. But once we did, then everything was streamlined.
So what am I remembering? Because the backdoor that I was thinking of was in MD 102, there was a bureaucratic policy for an exception.
Yes.
And it was the exception that allowed you to exploit and create your own bureaucracy.
Yes. So that was not actually the backdoor for writing this policy, but it was the backdoor for the streamlining itself. And yes, the way that worked is almost every good piece of bureaucracy has some sort of backdoor because the people who write it aren't crazy. So MD 102 said, you have to follow everything in this document, all these crazy things, unless you create a project tailoring plan and get it approved. You can tailor the process, in other words, but you have to get it approved. And we said, okay, we're going to tailor it pretty much to do the opposite of what MD 102 says. That'll be our tailoring. And so we did that. We wrote it up. And then the only question is, how do you get that approved? And we had some political support. We had some support here and there. That was very helpful. But ultimately, what got us the approval was we said, well, you don't have to accept this in the general case. Let's just do this once as a pilot. And then we can look at it and see if this actually did meet all the requirements. And I knew it would. I knew that it would satisfy everybody once they saw how we were doing it. So we did it as a pilot, just a one-time exception. And after that, we kept asking for the same exception every time around. And there was no good reason to turn us down because things had worked out really well the first time, as we knew they would.
You need to set some kind of precedence. I mean, the law works like that, right? There's a precedence and an exception, and that opens doors. It reminds me years and years ago, we had an example where we had to deal with procurement. And it was like, oh, you have to work with those people. Those are the only lists of people you can work with, unless it's something they can't deliver. And then it was all about requirements to shifting them to a point where they couldn't deliver, and therefore we could actually pick our own suppliers, which we needed to because we needed to produce a high-performance prototype, and it was just impossible to do it. So it's the same thing. It's interesting how to understanding the system.
There's a reason why I was going to say there's a reason why you need to establish that precedent. And it's because the bureaucracy is not just dreamed up by some evil person. I mean, the bureaucracy is there for a reason. And so every piece of bureaucracy has its goal. There's something it's trying to accomplish. And what you have to do is show that there's a different way to accomplish the same goal that's leaner. And that is the trick of the razor, essentially. Here's, if you want to implement a certain control through the bureaucracy, fine. We'll just show you a different way to implement that goal, to accomplish that goal, that control or whatever it is. And so you have to show a demonstration that you are accomplishing that same goal, achieving the same control. And once you've done that, then it's a lot easier for people to accept.